whole group. Yet to stand up in defense of someone would be to support him or her in her weakness. We were yelled and screamed at only because the leadership loved us and wanted the best for us. If we could not handle the pressure from those who loved us, how would we stand the pressure of those intending to persecute and kill us? We had to be tough in order to lead God's chosen people to spread the word over the world. In order to make it to the first peak, we had to travel over screes, which are piles of loose flat rocks scattered over the mountains. One wrong move, and we would be part of an avalanche of rocks. We gingerly crossed the screes and made it to Sunset Peak. The hike had been slow, and we would not be able to reach Capitan. Claude let us know in uncertain terms that it was a lack of determination, commitment, and believing which caused our failure. We were told the group would camp out on sunset that night and wake up before dawn to have a sunrise service. We arose about 5 the next morning, assembled on the side of the mountain. The sunrise was spectacular, after which we had our fellowship and then broke camp. As we descended the mountain, one of the women slipped and fell, rolling about 50 feet, until a tree stopped her fall. We raced to her side to see if she was okay. She was sitting up and checking her leg. No bones were broken, but she was scratched up pretty bad. Claude yelled at her and us again. He screamed we had fear in our lives and we would not go anywhere with our ministries if we did not change our attitudes. The rest of the hike was subdued as we tried to reach camp as soon as possible because we needed to prepare for the next day. Each of us would be going out on our own into the wilderness the next day. We would be all isolated from each other for 2 days. This would be our duo. We'd been told duos would be one of the most rewarding parts of our lead training. We would be placed in different areas by ourselves with water and matches. The only requirement was we each had to build a lean-to out of wood and pine needles. The reason it was called a duo was that it was you and God. It was time to get quiet and pray, seeking God's direction and vision in our lives. The next morning we got our sleeping bags, water journals, and Bibles together. Our twig leader took us to various locations and dropped us off. He showed me the area I was to stay in, instructed me to drink all of my water. He said he would be by later to share his evaluation of me, that he would be turning into the leadership. I started to gather wood for the fire and materials to build my hutch. Having gathered enough wood, I started to assemble the hutch by leaning sticks slantwise against a boulder. It made it just big enough to slide my sleeping bag under so it would retain my body heat. I then spread a foot-thick covering of pine needles over the frame. After making a circle of rocks in order to contain the fire, I built a teepee of wood and needles that caught fire quickly. I gathered enough wood to last me throughout the time there. I then settled down by the fire to write in my journal. The woods were quiet, which was not surprising considering it was the dead of winter. Thankfully, it was not very cold, and there was not any snow. I got very still and tried to let God speak to my heart. It wasn't long before the twig leader came to give me my evaluation. My scores were quite high, and I was pleased with what he had told me. It also told me I was going to have problems in my marriage because of my wife. She needed a lot of leadership and direction. He was referring to our hike up Sunset Peak and other things he had observed. It was no surprise my twig leader would say this to me. Rose had constantly complained about how I needed to take a stronger lead in the relationship. Yet when I would attempt to do this, she resented me for trying to do so. I was caught in a trap. I did not know how to escape. However, I believed God would give me the answer to change this situation. After my twig leader left, I busied myself, trying to get a word from the Lord. I stilled myself and tried to clear the clutter from my mind. I had so many things I wanted answers about. The only thing I heard clearly was a still small voice telling me if I wanted answers, I could not sit and wait for God to move me. I had to move, and then God would move me in the right direction. I sat straight up, and then got up doing things around the fire. I look back on the moment with mixed emotions. Though many years have passed, yet that moment is still crystal clear to me. I cannot say it is something I live by, nor can I say I cannot deny the wisdom it may contain. I choose to allow it to be unexplained, a mystery of sorts, as to what it meant, if anything at all. Part of my reluctance to embrace it is the context in which it happened. If I had not been part of the way, I can more readily accept its divine guidance. Yet, I could not rule out the possibility. God is certainly big enough to work through any situation. I can never deny He can. Being part of a group such as the Way makes it more difficult. The group defined who God was and how He works with individuals. To a degree, a group teaches that it has the only truth. The narrower the definition of truth, real or biblical, it maintains. Anything outside of their interpretation of truth must be considered evil and undesirable to those on the group's definition of the spiritual path. Any wisdom or facts that may contradict the group's definition must be ignored, ridiculed, or explained away to keep hold of the people involved. Now that I'm outside the group, I'm more willing to believe that I did have moments of insight. But ultimately, the group hampered my quest for truth and individual expression because of their view of who God was and how He operates with individuals could only be according to how the group determined. The other factor is fear, whether so named or not. In the Way, doubt, worry, and fear resulted in unbelief. This meant one would not receive the promises of God and that they could ultimately open themselves up to devil spirit possession if they had those doubt, fears, and unbelief. Once a person bought into the group's ideology of good and evil, they could never even consider reevaluating that decision to be in the group. To do so would be spiritual treason. After committing their life, time and money and energies for so many years, they would have extreme difficulty considering there would be alternatives. What would this say about their intelligence and abilities? Often it takes a number of years of sorting the wheat from the chaff. That night I used twigs to represent areas of my life I wanted to purify. As I watched the wood go up in smoke, I visualized God answering my prayers. I slept peacefully, looking forward to what tomorrow would bring. The next day was uneventful, and the twig leaders came around to gather everyone. The next day we broke camp early in the morning and headed back to the base camp. The trip back to the camp seemed much shorter than our trip from it. I suspected we were taking a much shorter route back to the camp than our leaders used when our packs were much heavier. Once back, we were greeted by a bonfire and a solid meal. Most of what we had been eating was freeze-dried or instant. While we sat around the fire, each of us considered the most meaningful part of the session and shared this with the rest of the group. We were then told we would get cleaned up by using sweat huts in the morning. There had to been a fire started in order to heat the rocks we would use. We went to sleep and arose early in order to clean up and leave. The sweat huts were up on a hill by a creek that ran down towards camp. The fire that heated the rocks was nearby. The huts had been constructed out of mud with a room for about 6 people. We were told to bring a change of clothing up to the huts along with our toiletries and water bottles. Since we had not washed for over a week and a half, we were pretty grimy. We were then ordered to strip down to nothing and take out our water bottles into the huts with us to drink, replenishing the water we would lose. After we were all huddled into the hut, the rocks were brought in and put in the center. A 10-gallon bucket of water was then brought in to the hut, and the water was thrown on the rocks. The result of this was the steam opening every pore in our bodies, and sweat and grime poured out. After sitting in the hut for about 20 minutes, we filed back out. We were then told to pair up with another and give a 10-gallon bucket. We had to go to the creek and fill the bucket with water. One of us would crouch down and the other would dump it on him. I cannot adequately describe the feeling of having ice-cold water dumped over my head in the middle of January in freezing temperatures after having my body temperature raised if I had been in the desert at high noon. You could almost hear the sounds of my pores slapping shut in protest. It was amazing that afterwards I was running around naked in the dead of winter and felt like I was out for a walk on a spring day. After the ordeal, we all shaved and dressed for the trip back to campus. Soon all the men were done, and we went down to camp and allowed the women their turn. As we passed, we gave them the sly smiles, knowing what they were about to experience. Soon after the women had received their torture, we packed our suitcases and headed towards the road. We were given a sack lunch and were reminded we had 35 hours to get back to campus in order to pass the training. We got our signs out and started to hitch rides. It wasn't long until a pickup came and gave 4 of us a ride. I sat in the back with Jim while the woman sat up front with the driver. The driver was from Mexico and was going to Amarillo. He could barely speak English, so communication was a problem. The ride was horrible for Jim and me. We asked our host if we could stop so we could get coffee and cigarettes. This was a major mistake. Remember the first chapter? Read it. On top of all this was the fact that we had not had any nicotine or caffeine in our bodies for the last 10 days. All this added up to a miserable ride. Once we were east of Amarillo, our driver stopped and said he was going to sleep. We thanked him for the ride and hit the road again. There were about 5 other couples on the road waiting for rides. Rose and I moved up the road so that the ones who had been there for longer would have the first chance of being picked up. It wasn't too long before a car passed up all the others and picked us up. He was headed towards Oklahoma City. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he was not very receptive. I gave up, instead passing the time looking at the scenery. He dropped us off at Interstate 35, and soon we were picked up by a trucker and dropped off at the front door of the campus. We invited him to stay for dinner, but he politely declined, saying he had deliveries to make. Rose and I were some of the first to arrive back on campus. We checked in, got back to our rooms, took nice long showers, and then went to supper. We were welcomed back by our Twig members, who asked us how things had gone. Those who had been on leave before us nodded knowingly, and those who had yet to go asked questions and silently envied our new spiritual growth. Shortly after everybody from the group arrived back, the leadership called all the group 114 together for a debriefing. We were all complimented on our successful trek to and from Tinney, but some were reprimanded for taking too long to get back. We were then asked what we had learned from our experience. The Corps coordinator's wife complimented me on what she saw as great spiritual growth in my life. I was proud of being singled